So we're continuing with a look at Albert Camus' book, The Rebel. And we've got to the chapter where he defines what a rebel actually is. And it's not quite what you might expect. In last week's episode we mentioned, looking at his introduction, he went back to his idea of the absurd and the injustice of the meaningless of life, and suggested that some of the potential responses to the problem of the absurd might be either suicide or murder, and he worked those out in the case studies of the people in The Outsider and the myth of Sisyphus. So suggestions of something violent, murder and suicide, and certainly the book was published in the beginning of the 1950s, so as we mentioned before, just after the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was going, when Communist China had just begun. They hadn't actually got up to the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and all those things, but all that had happened or was happening or was about to happen. So probably a time in human history, one of the most violent ever, one of the times when the most amount of human killings and dyings was going on. So a violent time, and he's talking about rebels, and you think of rebellions and revolutionary wars, of obviously a time of violence and upheaval and killing. So he's sort of expecting something like that. But then when he defines the rebel, it's really quite different. And he says that, and we think about, a rebel might be a serf, for example, who's being made to work for no pay, or an actual literal slave, or perhaps a impressed soldier who's got to go to war with something he doesn't believe in, or even children or students who feel they're being oppressed by their parents or their teachers, or people who might be disillusioned and angry and resentful and prone to violence. But no, that's not really what Camus is saying. What he says, in fact, is a rebel is someone who insists on a value in himself, but also in other people, even including his oppressor. So he feels that there is a value in everybody, in all humanity. So he's not trying to destroy anyone or depose anyone or put anyone down. In fact, what Camus says, that the rebel is someone who is quite willing to carry out the instructions that he's given as a slave or as a soldier or whatever. It's only when the one who is the oppressor, if you want to call it that, is asking him or expecting him to do something which is contrary to the subject's values. So he's quite willing to obey the commands given to him, even as a slave, as long as they don't contradict his own values. But when they do, then he has to rebel. So that really almost seems like a somewhat conservative idea, really, the idea of the value of each individual and the right of each individual to have his own thoughts and beliefs and to live his life the way he wants to. Not the sort of thing one would expect to find in Marx, for example. We're talking about the destruction of the bourgeoisie and the dictatorship of the proletariat and the class struggle and the destruction or total destruction of one class group. So that's not apparently in Camus' thinking. He's talking about each individual having value and worth, and the one who's going to rebel even valuing the worth of the one who might be his oppressor, but just being not willing to do something that conflicts with his own his own values. So it's really it's actually like something that Paul talks about in the New Testament. I mean, he talks about the question of slavery, and he says that slavery in itself may not necessarily be such a terrible situation. I mean, there are much worse things. And he says that ultimately, some people are born free, some people are born slaves, some people are made slaves. Whether you're a slave or free, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you're male or female, none of those things really are what's important. It's really what we are in God. We're all equal in God, and He values us, and that each man or woman, in whatever state he finds herself in, can have that full experience, or that full acceptance and realization by God and in God. So that's, again, one wouldn't expect this kind of thinking from someone who's supposedly a somewhat left-wing philosophical revolutionary, but so I'll just go. There's going to be so much in this. What I'll have to do is just quickly say what Camus is talking about, and not stop too much to try and say how I can integrate that in what I think is right or wrong, or even contradict it or try to confute it. So we'll just try and go ahead and just look at some of those points in turn. So having defined the rebel, he then goes on to talk about what he calls metaphysical insurrection or metaphysical rebellion, which is an unusual term, and again, typically he comes up with some other unusual ideas. So, quoting Ivan Karamazov again, the Dostoevsky character that we mentioned in the last few weeks, plays a big part in Camus' thinking and writing. So Ivan says, there's too much love in the world and no sufficient object for it, as there is no God, and so it must be squandered on humans. So what does one make of that? So there's so much love, it's almost as though someone as big and good as God would be the only one who really could be the recipient of all that love directed at him by people. But since he's not there, so Ivan says, and so Camus says, what do we do with all this love we have? We just have to spread it around on human beings who are not really worthy of it, so we're kind of wasting it. So that's his dilemma. And then he also says there are two possible worlds for people, for human beings. One is the world of the sacrosanct, or religion, where meaning comes just by grace. So the last couple of weeks we've been looking at how Camus thinks that there's really a lack of meaning because we just live briefly, then we're gone and there's nothing left, and there's no point, there's no meaning to anything. So if we want to establish some meaning in the world, have a world in which there is meaning, we can make it by having religion where the meaning comes by grace, and he says every word is an act of grace. So then God would be telling us things, God would be making meaning, he would be putting meaning into our lives, into our minds, but that would be grace, it would be coming from God. We wouldn't be creating it, he would just be giving it to us as a gift. So that's the world of the sacrosanct. The other alternative is the world of reason, where meaning comes into the world by human reason. And he says in that case, every word, with the sacrosanct, every word is a word of grace. In this world of reason, every word will be an act of rebellion, because we're making meaning up, rebelling against what? I'm not sure what he means by that. We're rebelling against someone who's not really there. But anyway, so we can have meaning imparted to us from someone outside, that is God, even if we've only made God up. Or we can impart meaning to ourselves by reasoning it out in our human brains, even if by doing that we're actually rebelling against this God that we don't really actually believe is even there. And going back to the idea that was mentioned before, that a rebel is someone who is resisting the imposition on him by an overseer or an oppressor of something which contravenes his own values, he then, so Camus reverts to this, what he's been talking about all the time in the last few books and in the last few weeks, the fact of this meaningless life that has been imposed on us by who? By God, but God isn't really there. So, and we suggested in one of the last week's episodes that behind all this absurd there is kind of an anger against God for being unjust, for having made us so ephemeral and fleeting and headed to nothingness. It's not fair, it's not just, and so he's angry against God. But then, as I said, he doesn't believe that. But so he does work that out a bit more, and so it becomes more apparent in this that it seems to me anyway. I said I wasn't going to look into it, how it integrated with my own ideas, but I'll have to in this case. It becomes more apparent that his idea of the absurd really is a protest against God. And even the rebellion, it turns out, is going to be a rebellion against God. So he says the rebel isn't an atheist, but he is a blasphemer. So it's not that he doesn't believe in God, he does believe in God, but he's going to tell God off. So he's going to be a blasphemer, really, because God has created this impossible situation where he's made us to be alive, to have consciousness, and he's just going to take it all away again just like that and leave us with nothing. So there's an injustice that's been imposed on us by God, apparently, and so human beings then, suffering from that injustice, will need to create a justice of their own, have to create a just system so that they will have some justice to live in. And to do that, they will have to overthrow the rule of God and introduce a whole new system, one which has justice which has been lacking in the old system. So what he will need to do is to establish the dominion of man, even if that means committing sin in the process. So having said that, he's admitted quite a lot, and when you look back to the philosophy of most of the, especially the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, it's really all about that, saying we're going to overthrow God and we're going to establish a human system, a human dominion, which we might find some justice and meaning in that, and we'll probably have to commit sin, we'll have to commit blasphemy to do it. And he says that's what the 20th century is all about.